Alright, hey guys, welcome to your video lecture for TCI lesson 16. And this week's chapter is on life in medieval towns. However, before we get into chapter 16, I wanted to spend the first few minutes of this video going over the answers to last week's discussion board with you guys. So again, last week was lesson 15, which was on the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages as well. So for section 1, you had two questions. First was describe two types of power that the Roman Catholic Church acquired in society after the fall of Rome. So the church acquired economic power, becoming the largest landholder in Europe by 1050. It also acquired substantial political power, in part because few people besides the clergy could read. So as a result, they became really influential, both economically and politically. The second question that you guys had, in your own words, summarize the conflict between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Use the words appoint, duty, excommunicate, beg, and authority in your summary. So your response probably looked a little bit different, but again, as long as you use the words correctly and you are able to accurately describe the conflict between these two men, you guys would be good to go. This is just an example. So it says, Pope Gregory VII banned the practice whereby kings, instead of the Pope, could appoint members of the clergy. Henry IV considered it his duty and privilege to appoint church officials. He declared that Gregory was no longer Pope, so Gregory excommunicated Henry. Henry had to beg forgiveness, and in doing so, he showed that he acknowledged the Pope's authority, even over an emperor. All right, so for section 2, according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, what was the purpose of sacraments? Receiving the sacraments, like baptism, confirmation, penance, etc., was essential to gaining salvation. Section 3, why did people undertake pilgrimages during the Middle Ages? What were some of the popular destinations of pilgrims? So people went on pilgrimages to show their devotion to God as an act of penance for their sins or in hope of being cured of an illness. Some popular pilgrimage destinations were Jerusalem, Rome, and Canterbury. Section 4. In what ways did the art of medieval Europe reflect the influence of the Roman Catholic Church? Most art was made for religious purposes. Paintings and sculptures in churches helped people to worship. Since most people couldn't read, art helped to tell the story of Jesus' life or Bible stories in a way that everyone could understand. Section 5. Explain two advances in education during the Middle Ages. A new form of writing with both upper and lowercase letters made reading easier. Also, universities were created for advanced study. Section 6, the word holiday comes from holy day. And what types of things did Christian holidays celebrate? Christian holidays celebrated Christian saints, events in the life of Jesus, and other important religious ideas. And then lastly, for section 7, explain at least one similarity and difference between Benedictine monks and Franciscan friars. So if you guys look at the chart that I have on the right-hand side for you, I've kind of outlined some of the similarities and differences, again, between the two. So where did they live? Benedictine monks lived in monasteries, which were communities devoted to prayer and service to fellow Christians. Franciscan friars traveled among ordinary people to preach and to care for the poor and sick. What promises or sacrifices did they make in order to join? So Benedictine monks followed Benedict's rule, which required poverty, chastity, and obedience. Franciscan friars had to live in complete poverty and work or beg for food for themselves and the poor. And then lastly, how did they spend their time? Benedictine monks prayed, studied, and worked. They attended church services, cared for the poor and sick. They also taught and farmed. And then lastly, Franciscan friars cared for the poor as well and the sick. They also traveled and spent a majority of their time praying as well. All right, so that being said, we are going to move on to TCI lesson 16 now, which is life in medieval towns. So again, you guys have the option to watch the rest of this video lecture in order to learn this information. Or if you prefer, you can head to Clever, log into TCI, and go read lesson 16 independently. You are more than welcome to do both. You guys have that option, however you learn best. If you are sticking with the video, like I said last time, you guys are more than welcome to pause, take notes if you need to, so that you can go back and reference those when you start to fill out the discussion board questions. Again, those questions are due by Friday at 11:59 p.m. On Thursday, we will have our virtual office hours meeting if you guys are interested. And then Friday morning, you will have your weekly check-in posted as well. All right, so again, if you are choosing to do the independent reading, you guys can turn the video off now, head to Clever. If not, we're going to get started. So our essential question for this chapter is, what was life like in a medieval town? We have 4 objectives that you guys should be able to grasp, answer, talk about at the conclusion of this video. The first is explain how geographic factors affected the development of towns in medieval Europe. The second is discuss the relationship between trade and the growth of medieval towns. The third, examine several aspects of daily life in medieval towns. And then last, describe the typical day of a townsperson in medieval Europe. So this first slide is just the introduction to lesson 16. You guys will not have a corresponding discussion board question for the intro, but again, this is just setting the stage for the rest of the chapter. So if you think back to 2 videos ago, we talked about the 3 distinct time periods that the Middle Ages are broken up into. You have the early Middle Ages, you have the high Middle Ages, and you have the late Middle Ages. So just make sure that you're keeping those distinct time periods in mind as we are jumping around a little bit. Right now, we're going to talk about the late Middle Ages, which lasted from about 1300 to 1450, a time in which people experienced a shift in daily life. So at the start of the Middle Ages, so the early Middle Ages, most people lived in the countryside, either on feudal manors or in religious communities. Many people owned or worked on farms where they produced their own food. But by the 12th century, towns were emerging around castles and monasteries and along trade routes as well. Almost all medieval towns were protected by thick stone walls and required visitors to enter through gates. Inside, homes and businesses lined unpaved streets. Since few people could read, signs with colorful pictures hung over the doorways of shops and businesses. There were open squares in front of public buildings, such as churches, which served as large gathering places or marketplaces for the purpose of exchanging goods. Most streets were very, very narrow. The second stories of houses typically jutted out, which would block the sunlight from reaching the streets. And in addition, there was no garbage service. So typically people, as they were living their lives in their homes, if they had garbage, if they had trash, if they had, rotten food, stuff of that nature, they didn't have a disposal system. So they would typically just throw it in the streets or in nearby rivers, nearby canals. So as you can imagine, medieval towns were not incredibly sanitary places. They didn't smell super great. But hopefully this paints a little bit of a picture for you guys for you to keep in mind as we go through the remainder of these slides. All right, so like I said, in this lesson, you will learn about the growth of medieval towns. Then you guys will look at several aspects of daily life. You will explore trade and commerce, homes and households. We're going to look at disease and medical treatment, along with crime and punishment. And then lastly, you guys will see some examples of leisure and entertainment that went on in medieval towns as well. So starting with section 1, which is the growth of medieval towns. All right, so in the ancient world, town life was well established, particularly in Greece and Rome. Ancient towns were busy trading centers, but after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, trade with the East suffered and town life actually declined. So in the early Middle Ages, most people in Western Europe lived in scattered communities in the countryside. However, like I kind of talked about on the last slide, by the High Middle Ages, towns were growing again. One reason for their growth was improvements in agriculture. So farmers were clearing forests and adopting better farming methods, which resulted in a surplus of crops for them to sell in town markets. If you don't remember what surplus means, that just means that there is more available than what is needed or used. So because of this surplus, that allowed farmers to go ahead and sell them in markets, to sell the extra that they didn't necessarily need for themselves or for their families. Because of these surpluses, not everyone had to farm to feed themselves, because you could now go to the market to purchase the things that you needed. Another reason for the growth of towns was the revival of trade. So seaport towns such as Venice and Genoa and Italy served as trading centers for goods from the Middle East and Asia. So within Europe, merchants often transported goods by river, and many towns grew near these waterways. So again, they really wanted to be centrally located in order to receive trade, in order to have a convenient route to not only receive goods, but to sell and transport goods as well. Many merchants who sold their wares or their products in towns became permanent residents. So you didn't really have as many nomadic traders anymore. You have people who are going to kind of set up shop in a settlement. They're going to stay stationary because they have access now to these waterways, to these port cities, to these really popularized trade routes. So because of this, because of this, some towns grew wealthier because local people specialized in making specific types of goods. So if you guys think back to junior achievement, for example, we talked a lot about specialization, or rather, your JA rep did. So specialization, meaning that different cities are going to be known for different products, perfecting different goods. And as a result, you might trade with one of those towns that is exceptionally good at making that product. And in exchange, they might want something that your town is specialized in. So an example of this would be present day Belgium and Netherlands. They were known for their fine cloth. Meanwhile, workers in the Italian city of Venice produced glass, and other towns built their wealth on the banking industry that grew to help people trade more easily. So at the beginning of the Middle Ages, towns were generally part of the domain of a feudal lord. Okay, so all that land would have been owned by the nobility. And again, if you think back to the feudal system, depending where you fell on that chart or in that hierarchy, you might, be a merchant, you might be a serf, so you're tied to that land. Again, that's the beginning of the Middle Ages. So as towns grew wealthier, town dwellers begin to resent the lord's feudal rights and his demand for high taxes. So they felt that they no longer needed the lord's protection or his interference for that matter. In some places, such as northern France and Italy, violence erupted as towns struggled to become independent, meaning that they wanted to break away from that feudal system. They didn't want to be under the control of a feudal lord any longer. In other places, such as England and parts of France, the change was more peaceful. I actually think I have this on the next slide. Yep, there we go. So like I said, in other places such as England and parts of France, the change was more peaceful, Many towns became independent by purchasing a royal charter. A charter is a written grant of rights and privileges by a ruler or government to a community, a class of people, or an organization. So if you could purchase this royal charter, you are essentially just purchasing the rights to that land. So that granted them the right to govern themselves, to make laws, and raise taxes. Free towns were often governed by a mayor and a town council. So power gradually shifted away from the feudal lords to the rising class of merchants and craftspeople. So those people that were busy gaining wealth because of their new proximity to trade routes, to port cities, to various waterways as well. All right, so if you guys look at this chart on on this map on the right-hand side, so this is taken right from TCI. It is medieval European towns and trade routes. This is about 1500 CE. So if you guys look at the red lines, those represent land routes. If you look at the purple lines, you can look at the water routes, and the black dot there, that represents larger cities that began to develop. So if you look at where all of these cities are located, they are at least accessible to the land route, if not a water route in addition. So again, trade and proximity to these routes, to these trading pathways, was really important to the growth of these medieval European towns / cities. All right, so we're going to move on to section 2 now, which is on guilds. So medieval towns began as centers for trade, like we just discussed, but they soon developed into places where many goods were produced as well. So as a result, both trade and production were overseen by organizations that began to develop called guilds. So guilds is an organization of people in the same craft or the same trade. So they are specializing in specific jobs, specific skills. And it's a collection and organization of these people that all happen to do the same thing or have the same skill. So there were two main kinds of guilds. There were merchant guilds and craft guilds. All types of craftspeople had their own guilds, from cloth makers to cobblers, which were people who fixed shoes, belts, and other leather goods, and also the stonemasons, who were responsible for building a lot of the great cathedrals that we looked at during lesson 15. So what's the point of a guild? Why did these develop? Why did they form? Well, guilds provided help and protection for the people doing a certain kind of work. And in addition, they also maintained really high standards as well. So guilds controlled the hours of work and helped set prices. They also handled complaints from the public. So for example, if a coal merchant cheated a customer, it might reflect poorly on all of the coal merchants. So as a result, the guilds would punish these members who had bad practices that were making a bad name for the rest of the people in that profession. Guild members would pay dues to their organization, meaning that they would have to pay a certain amount in order to be a member of this organization. Starting at age 12, a boy and occasionally a girl could become an apprentice. So if you guys want to kind of switch gears and look at this chart on the right-hand side, this is what I'm going to walk you guys through real quick. So like I said, starting around age 12, you could become an apprentice. An apprentice is a person who works for a master in a trade or craft in return for training. So these apprentices are going to work for typically 2 to 7 years. During that time, they are required to obey the master, but as a result, they'll be trained. The apprentice's parents would sign an agreement with the master of the trade. The master agreed to shelter, feed, and train the apprentice. In some cases, the parents paid the master a sum of money, but apprentices rarely got paid for their work. At the end of 7 years, apprentices had to prove to the guild that they had mastered their trade. To do this, an apprentice produced a piece of work called a masterpiece. If the guild approved of the work, the apprentice was given the right to become a master and set up his or her own business. Well, setting up a business was expensive, and few people could afford to do it right away. So often they became a journeyman instead. The word journeyman does not refer to a journey, but actually comes from the French word as well. A journeyman was a craftsperson who found work by the day instead of becoming a master who employed other workers. So if you look at this chart, it'll kind of break down each position for you. Like I said, journeymen would work for a master to earn a salary. They worked 6 days a week typically. They needed to produce this masterpiece in order to become a master. And again, if they could afford to start up their own business, they could become a master, who is someone who owned his own shop, worked with other masters to protect their trade, so in this guild. And also sometimes they served in the government as well. And it was then those masters that would hire more apprentices and kind of start the cycle over again. All right, so let's move on to section 3. Section 3 is really important for us because it focuses on trade and commerce, which is going to be really, really integral in the formation and the growth of a lot of these medieval towns. So what brought most people to towns was business. So again, meaning trade and commerce. As trade and commerce grows, so did the towns. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, most trade was in luxury goods, which only the wealthy could afford. So people made everyday necessities for themselves. But by the High Middle Ages, more local people were buying and selling more kinds of products, including everyday goods like food, clothing, and household items. Different towns began specializing in producing certain goods, such as cloth, glass, and silk. Most towns had a market where food and local goods were bought and sold. Much larger were the great merchant fairs, which a town might hold a couple of times a year. These fairs could attract merchants from many countries who sold goods from all over Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. With the growth of trade and commerce, merchants grew increasingly powerful and wealthy. They ran sizable businesses and looked for trading opportunities far from home. Merchant guilds came to dominate the business lives in both towns and cities. And towns that had become independent, members of merchant guilds often sat on town councils or were elected mayor. So it's these guilds, these organizations of people of all one craft or all one skill or trade. They ended up having a lot of political significance as well. However, not everyone prospered. Not everyone was doing as well. Medieval towns commonly had sizable Jewish communities, but in Christian Europe, they often faced deep prejudice. So the hostility of Christians, sometimes backed up by laws, made it difficult for Jews to earn their living. They were not allowed to own land, and their lords sometimes took their property and belongings at will. Jews could also be the targets of significant violence back then as well. One opportunity that was open to Jews was to become bankers and money lenders. This work was generally forbidden to Christians because the church taught that charging money for loans was sinful. Jewish bankers and moneylenders performed an essential service for the economy. But again, since this was forbidden by the Catholic Church, they were still often looked down upon and abused for practicing this less favorable or this negative trade. All right, guys, section 4 now is going to talk about homes and households that were common in medieval Europe. I just noticed that this picture comes over a little too far. There we go. All right, so medieval towns were typically very small and very, very crowded. They were narrow and could be up to 4 stories high. Most of the houses were made of wood and they tended to lean over time. So sometimes two facing houses would lean so much that the tops of them would touch each other from across the street. Rich and poor people lived in very, very different households. In poorer neighborhoods, several families might occupy a single house with only one room in which they cooked, ate, and slept. And in general, people worked where they lived. So, for example, if a father or mother was a weaver, their loom would be in their home, and that's where they would spend most of their time actually creating their product. Wealthy merchants, however, often had really, really splendid homes. They had really nice houses. The first level might be given over to a business, including offices and maybe storerooms. The family's living quarters might be on the second level, complete with a space for the family to gather and eat and talk. An upper level might be where the house servants and apprentices were housed. Even for wealthy families, though, life was not always comfortable compared to life today. With fireplaces as the main source of heat and light, rooms were often really cold, really smoky, and really dim. Most windows were small and covered with an oiled parchment instead of glass, so little sunlight came through. Growing up in a medieval town wasn't easy either. About half of all children died before they became adults, and those who did survive began preparing for their adult roles around the age of 7. Some boys and few girls attended school where they learned to read and write. Children from wealthier families might learn to paint and to play music on a lute, which was a type of stringed instrument. Other children soon began their work as apprentices, which again starts around the age of 7. In general, people of the Middle Ages believed in an orderly society in which everyone knew their place. Most boys grew up to do the same work as their fathers. Some girls trained for a craft, but most married young, usually around the age of 15, and were soon raising children of their own. For many girls, their education was at home, where they learned cooking, cloth making, and other skills necessary to care for a home and a family. All right, so section 5 is on disease and medical treatment. So, like I said a few slides ago, medieval towns were typically very unsanitary. They were smelly. They were rat and bug and animal infested, typically. They were incredibly dirty places. There was no running water in homes. And instead of bathrooms, people used outdoor, what's called privies, which were shelters used as toilets. Or they would use chamber pots that they emptied into nearby streams and canals. Like I said earlier, garbage too was typically tossed into streams and canals or just onto the street. People lived crowded together in small spaces and usually bathed only once a week, if that. Rats and fleas were common and often carried diseases, so it's no wonder that people were frequently ill living in these towns. Many illnesses that can be prevented or cured today had no cures in medieval times. An example of this is a disease called leprosy, which is a disease of the skin and nerves that causes open sores. Because leprosy can spread from one person to another and can cause death, lepers were ordered to live by themselves in isolated houses, usually far away from towns. Some towns even passed laws to keep out the lepers or the people that suffered from that disease. Common diseases for which there were no cure at this time included measles, cholera, smallpox, and scarlet fever. However, the most feared disease was the bubonic plague, which is also known as the Black Death. So we are going to get to more on that the next slide. Because no one knew exactly how diseases were spread, typically they would find someone to blame. So, for example, after an outbreak of an illness, a sorry guys. So, for example, after an outbreak of an illness, Typically, less favored groups would be kind of the target of unjust anger and suspicion, and they were typically accused of doing things like poisoning wells or inflicting this disease on people. Although hospitals were invented during the Middle Ages, there were very, very few of them. And when sickness struck, most people were treated in their homes by family members or sometimes a doctor. Medieval doctors believed in a combination of both prayer and medical treatment in order to help cure or to treat their patients. These medical treatments typically involved using herbs. Using herbs as medicine had a really long history based on traditional folk wisdom and knowledge that's handed down from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Other treatments were based on less scientific methods. So, for example, medieval doctors sometimes consulted the positions of the planets and relied on magic charms in order to help heal people. Another common technique was to bleed patients by opening a vein or applying leeches to the skin to suck out the blood. Medieval doctors believed that this bloodletting, is what it was called, helped restore balance to the body and to the spirit. However, we know now that this actually only weakened patients further. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the Black Death, and I have a short video which I'm going to try to play on the next slide. I don't know how it's going to work with the screen sharing, but we will see how it goes. So you guys can just follow along with me. I'm going to read this right off the screen. So the Black Death was a devastating global epidemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. The plague arrived in Europe in October of 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered on the docks were met with a horrifying surprise. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, almost 1/3 of the continent's population. So back then, we've talked about this a lot. People did not have an understanding of the biology of the disease. So as a result, many people believed that the Black Death was a kind of divine punishment or retribution for sins against God, such as greed, blasphemy, and heresy. By this logic, the only way to overcome the plague was to win God's forgiveness. Some people believe that the way to do this was to purge their communities of heretics and other troublemakers who they suspected of being unfaithful or being the cause of this widespread disease. All right, so let's see if this works.
Plague is notorious for causing mass sickness and devastation. But as much tragedy as the disease has caused, it also helped drive crucial scientific and social progress. Plague is an infectious disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It mainly affects rodents and spreads by way of insects. Because of these insect carriers, plague has been passed on to humans with devastating consequences. 3 major plague pandemics have occurred in human history, and while they occurred centuries apart, they shared similar traits that paved the way for the spread of disease. One cause of plague pandemics was the rise of international trade. Trade routes connected once isolated communities and created large economic networks. But by facilitating the movement of goods between communities, trade routes also facilitated the movement of germs. International trade was an impetus for the first plague pandemic on record, the Plague of Justinian. In the 6th century, outbreaks began in Egypt, and thanks to land and sea trade routes, they spread throughout the Byzantine Empire. Named after the emperor at the time, the Plague of Justinian is estimated to have wiped out about half of Europe's population. growing economies also made way for urbanization and a rising urban population. This resulted in crowded neighborhoods and the accumulation of waste, which created unsanitary living conditions. Cities and their residents essentially became incubators for germs and diseases. This was particularly evident in the second and most infamous plague pandemic. In the 14th century, Europe was experiencing an economic and population boom, especially in cities. Proper waste management did not exist at the time, making cities vulnerable to disease. After trade routes brought plague from Asia, where it killed millions in China and the Middle East, the disease wiped out about a third of Europe's population, earning itself the moniker the Black Death. What also aided in the transmission of the disease was the lack of medical knowledge. For most of human history, the cause of illnesses, germs, was unknown, making sicknesses like the plague a mystery. This lack of knowledge drove the spread of disease as recently as the 19th century. Outbreaks in northwest India eventually reached major port cities in China. In just over a century, plague was exported throughout the globe and caused outbreaks in every continent except Antarctica, making it the most widespread pandemic in history. This plague pandemic, however, was the last. In 1894, scientists discovered the bacteria behind the plague outbreaks. Their discovery helped further developments in microbiology, medicine, urban planning, and sanitation methods, which led to the treatment and prevention of the disease. Economic expansion, urbanization, and a lack of medical knowledge contributed to the disastrous spread of plague. In turn, however, the disease helped catapult crucial advancements in science and public health, very well making plague pandemics a thing of the past.
All right, guys, moving on to section 6, crime and punishment. So besides being unhealthy, medieval towns were very noisy, smelly, crowded, and they're often really unsafe as well. So pickpockets and thieves were always on the lookout for vulnerable travelers who had money in their pouches. Towns were especially dangerous at night because there were no streetlights. In some cities, night watchmen patrolled the streets with candle lanterns to try to deter or discourage criminals from acting. People accused of crimes were held in dirty, crowded jails. Prisoners relied on family and friends to bring them food or money, or else they risked starving or being ill treated in that jail. In the early Middle Ages, trial by ordeal or combat was often used to establish an accused person's guilt or innocence. In a trial by ordeal, the accused had to pass a dangerous test, such as being thrown into a deep well. Unfortunately, a person who floated instead of drowning was declared guilty because he or she had been rejected by the water. In a trial by combat, the accused person had to fight to prove his or her innocence. People believed that God would ensure that the right person won. People in the clergy, women and children, and disabled people were allowed to name a champion or someone who could fight on their behalf if they were being accused of a crime. Punishments for crimes were very harsh. So for lesser crimes, people were fined or put in the stocks, which is a wooden frame with holes for the person's arms and sometimes for their legs. Being left in the stocks publicly for hours or days was both painful and humiliating. So that's the photo down here at the bottom. It's showing you guys what the stocks looked like. People found guilty of crimes such as robbery, stealing livestock, treason, or murder could be hanged or burned at the stake. Executions were carried out in public, often in front of really large crowds. In most parts of Europe, important nobles shared with monarchs the power to prosecute major crimes. So in England, kings in the early 1100s began creating a nationwide system of royal courts. The decisions of royal judges contributed to a growing body of common law. What I mean by common law, which is a body of rulings made by judges, were very old traditional laws that became a part of a nation's legal system. Along with an independent judiciary or court system, English common law would become an important safeguard of individual rights. Throughout Europe, court trials based on written and oral evidence eventually replaced these trials by ordeal or combat. All right, and finally, we will move on to section 7, which is on leisure and entertainment. Many aspects of town life, as I'm sure you guys know by now, were really challenging, and people worked really, really hard, given some pretty unfortunate circumstances that they were up against. But they also participated in leisure activities as well. They enjoyed quite a few days off of work, and in medieval times, people engaged in many of the same activities that people might today. So, for example, children played with dolls and toys, such as wooden swords, balls, and hobby horses. So that's this first picture down here on the left-hand side. Adults also liked games such as chess, checkers, and backgammon. They might also gather to play card games, go dancing, or to enjoy other various activities. Townspeople also took time off of work to celebrate special days, such as religious feasts. Fair days were especially festive as jugglers, dancers, and clowns entertained the fair goers, where people would perform songs, they would recite poetry, and play instruments such as the harp, while guild members paraded through the streets dressed in special costumes and carrying banners. Guilds also staged what were called mystery plays, in which they acted out certain Bible stories. Often they would perform stories that were appropriate to their guild. So, for example, boat builders might act out the story of Noah and the ark, because again, it kind of relates to their skill, to their trade, and their job. Mystery plays gave rise to another type of religious drama, which was called the miracle play. These plays would dramatize or they would depict the lives of saints, often showing the saints performing miracles or wonders. So, again, like we talked about in lesson 15, a lot of entertainment, a lot of these festivals and plays were still very, very heavily focused on religion, specifically Christianity. All right, guys, so that wraps up your video lecture for lesson 16. So again, you guys can head to the discussion board. Please make sure that you are responding to all of the questions in one post, and your responses need to be in complete sentences, please. Okay? As always, if you guys have any questions, let me know. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I will see some of you guys on Thursday for our office hours.